Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath, an original novel by Scott Phillips. Chapter 11. Loosen up, Townsend told his team. He didn't know if it was for fear or something else, but they couldn't seem to maintain a reasonable distance from each other. They kept closing together, preparing for the same kind of attack Jason had made before. They had to stay close enough so that psycho couldn't pick them off one by one, but far enough apart to unload on the bastard if he should ambush them again. Townsend ran a roll call in his head, counting off the operators accompanying him. Noon, Garb, Connolly, Howard, Lovinger, Chaffin, Marr. That was 8 men, including him, or 7 men and 1 ass-ripping Hellcat, if he categorized Noon realistically. Was it stupid to split up back there and send the others back to the lab? Maybe they should have all gone back to the transport and driven the rest of the way to Camp Crystal Lake. It's not like they had to worry about scaring Jason off, obviously. Besides, the trip to the camp was just to assess casualties. Fuck. That's what he should have done. It would have occurred to him if Noon hadn't been barking at him, and if he weren't so worried about the agency wanting them all to die. Jesus, what was he doing? Talking to himself into being a fuck-up. That's what. And now he was trying to blame it on somebody else. What a terrific commander he was. He'd made a bad choice. Now they had to deal with it. At least he'd had the presence of mind to tell Mosley to give the team an hour, then bring the lab up to the campground. They'd have a ride home. It was all going to be fine, just as long as Jason didn't leap out and hack all of them apart in the meantime. The last 40 minutes had given Townsend a unique insight into Walter Hobbs' feelings. 3 men were lost in seconds, 2 more wounded. Like a switch being thrown. 1 minute they were trapezing through the woods, the next their faces were split open or their heads cut off. And now they were marching along like nothing has happened, fulfilling the mission, while the bodies were still cooling off out there. No wonder Walt was so tormented, especially with the blame being laid on his doorstep. They could see a few lights from Camp Crystal Lake through the trees now. The place was deathly quiet. How many people had he counted when the team had first arrived? 25? 30? Were they all dead now? And what the hell had they been thinking, getting themselves into this? That woman who'd come screaming out of the woods, what was her name? Kelly? She was young and pretty. You'd think she'd have the sense to find a new church to attend, once Jason Voorhees had made an appearance on the altar. Maybe she spent Friday nights bowling with the Manson family, too. Townsend signaled to the others, and the team came to a halt. They were about 20 yards from the tree line in the parking area beyond. The whole thing felt vaguely similar to the strike on the Yuppie Meth Lab, only the cars parked outside weren't as expensive, and of course the campground was full of dead churchgoers. Townsend stared at Camp Crystal Lake. The place seemed sinister when viewed through the eerie greenish cast of his night vision goggles. Show some movement. Somebody's got to be alive in there. He scanned the area carefully, then panned back again. There! Someone inside the school bus. How had he missed it before? The parking lot was illuminated by a string of lights hanging overhead. It was lit up like a Little League ball field. Wait, 2 people on the bus. Probably ran there to hide from Jason. Good God. Could they be the only survivors? Feeling sick to his stomach, Townsend signaled to the rest of the team, and they moved forward once again. As they stepped past the tree line and into the parking lot, he focused on the bus. A bright flash lit up Townsend's night vision viewfinder. Then the bullet hit him in the face. The look in Curtis Rickles' eyes said it all as he watched Townsend collapse to the ground, a ribbon of blood trailing behind. Semper Fi, motherfucker! Rickles had moved past the bus, parking it parallel to the main building, with its door facing the cabin to provide an escape route. Then he and Stan Day took seats, loaded up their rifles, and settled in to wait. He knew, when he'd heard the gunfire earlier, that it wouldn't be long before the strike team made their assault on the church. Of course, he had personally seen to Meredith Host's safety before going off to defend the church. Had to protect the wriggling and shapely little embodiment of his future. Some folks might say there wasn't much of a future to be concerned about now that Jason Voorhees was sorting the wheat from the chaff amongst the ministry's followers. Rickles knew otherwise. He would readily admit that he'd done more than his share of sinning in the past. But such was his faith in Father Long. Rickles knew that the good Father's ministries had cleaned his soul up real sweet, and anything untoward he might be harboring in there could just as easily undergo the Lord's own pressure wash, and he'd be as good as new. Hadn't he evaded Jason's judgment back in the church and come away with nothing but a cut on the arm and some urine-soaked trousers? In Rickles' mind, that was like having God come down and say, "Son, you're okay. Now go forth and do some multiplying with that saucy young thing you've had your eye on." Even better, Meredith's attitude towards him seemed to have changed, thanks to the soul-sorting hubbub Jason had brought to the congregation. Back there in the main cabin, she'd gentled down just fine when he had told her to. Even held on to him in what he had to admit was quite the boner-inducing embrace. And when he took her off to find a safe place to sit out the battle he knew was coming, she'd even give him a loving kiss right on the lips, no less. Let's face it, the girl was coming around to his way of thinking. Frontier times were here again, with the mystery commandos acting the part of the bloodthirsty Indians on the warpath, and Jason Voorhees doing a fine job as the hungry bear stalking the forest. Rickles smiled broadly and fired 2 more shots at the invaders, the second one finding its target, another man down. The ex-Marine hated combat, but not nearly as much as he hated people trying to fuck with his shit. Next to Rickles, Day was blasting away like a wild man. Rickles was pleased to hear gunfire from the roof and from the woods on the lake side of the parking area. His men were defending the faith, all right. Then the strike team returned fire. Slugs pounded the school bus, rocking the vehicle. The 5.56 caliber rounds punched through the thin metal, turning the inside of the bus into a death trap. Time to get the hell out of there, Rickles slapped Day on the shoulder, getting his attention. "Let's beat feet," the ex-Marine insisted. Staying low, the 2 men hustled off the bus as bullets smashed through the windows and thudded into the tired old seats, sending tufts of stuffing into the air. Rickles was out the door first, leaping to the ground, and almost fell down when his bad left foot came down wrong. A slug tore through the side of the bus about 4 inches away from him, whizzing past and thunking into a post on the cabin's porch. The ex-Marine bolted for the cabin's door with Stan Day hot on his heels. Even with gunfire lighting up the night, Rickles could only think about how Meredith would greet her conquering hero once the dust had settled. Sprawled in the dirt, Townsend felt like he ought to be writhing in pain, but the bullet had severed something vital and he couldn't even twitch. He lay there, slowly working his jaw, trying to belt out orders to his team. All he could hear was a disgusting gurgle, accompanied by the grinding of bone. The slug from the hunting rifle had torn his lower jaw apart and punched through his spine before zinging off into the woods. Oh, and he could hear lots of gunfire and shouting. Everything had gone wrong. Staring up at the sky through the night vision goggles, Townsend realized Frenchie would be working her shift at Lefty's Lounge this time of night. After Townsend was hit, the whole place had gone up like the 4th of fucking July. Fucking Jesus freaks must have had men planted all over the campground, and somebody had had enough sense to figure the strike team would be using night vision, so they did a particularly good job of keeping themselves out of sight. Samantha Noon had seen Levinger take a bullet and drop, but the man had quickly scuttled back into the trees and was returning fire. The rest of the team was trying to do the same. Noon opened up with her FN MK-46, putting several rounds into a cluster of trees across the parking area, where she'd seen muzzle flashes before. Somebody over there screamed. She heard a thwipping sound next to her ear. That one almost had her name on it. Moving backwards and sustaining fire, she hustled for the trees, slipping behind the first fat oak she came to. Peering out, she saw Connolly make a break for the school bus, and the 2 trucks parked nearby. No wonder. The guy was carrying a shotgun and needed to close the distance between himself and any targets of opportunity. His head came apart before he could make cover. Noon watched Connolly's body do a jerking dance before it slumped forward in the dirt. What did they call this place? Camp Blood? She recoiled as a big slug chewed into the tree she hid behind, showering her with splinters. Some of those assholes were carrying cap guns, but a few of them had obviously done their share of elk hunting before Jesus called them to service. "Anybody got a milker?" Noon shouted. How long before those assholes would show up at the campground? She pulled a frag grenade, yanked the pin, and hurled it as hard as she could. No one would ever accuse Samantha Noon of throwing like a girl. The grenade hit the top of the school bus, bounced, and went off between the bus and the cabin. What glass was left in the windows of the bus blew out towards, and the front windows of the cabin were blown in, flinging deadly shards into the building. Inside the cabin, Manny Crinkle shrieked as his body was ribboned by the flying glass. Wet chunks of the man splattered the big room. One of his hands flopped onto the floor near Rickles, who had only taken a few slivers in the back. Gritting his teeth in pain, Rickles ticked off seconds in his head, counting down to the moment Don James and his men would enter the battle. Townsend's vision was clouding, or maybe his goggles had been damaged and were failing. Whatever it was, he couldn't see well anymore. Breathing wasn't exactly a walk in the park either. He kept choking on all the blood in his throat. If he could just roll over, maybe it would drain out of his mouth. He strained to flop himself over, but his muscles just would not cooperate. Samantha Noon couldn't figure out what the hell the religious idiots were doing. Didn't they realize the team was here to protect them from Jason? Bible-thumping assholes were going to have to die, that's all there was to it. She pulled another frag grenade, clamped the pin in her teeth, feeling like John Wayne, and tugged it loose. Then bullets came from behind and pummeled the ground around her, coming from the rear. Fuck. The sons of bitches have flanked the team. There were muzzle flashes going off all over the place out there. Oops. She was holding the armed grenade. Noon tossed it towards his new bastard, watching as the woods lit up. She thought she saw part of a leg go whipping into the air. Lead was flying at the team from every direction. Noon clenched her teeth. With Townsend down, somebody needed to call the shots. She didn't figure she could make things much worse by barking a few orders. "Operators," she yelled, "we are leaving!" That's if they could make it out of there at all. Unleashing a brutal hail of gunfire towards the rearward assault, Noon bolted for denser force, shouting as she ran, "Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!" The other members of the team didn't hesitate, laying down covering fire, doing their best to get out of there. Only Lovinger was dragging ass, forced to hop on one leg thanks to the slug he'd taken when the ambush had begun. Chaffin, coming up behind his fellow operator, hooked a shoulder under Lovinger's arm and helped him along, letting the wounded man provide most of the covering fire for them. While the gunfire coming from the camp itself slowed, then stopped, Don James and his defenders of the ministry dogged the strike team, keeping up a barrage of harassment fire to be sure they didn't slow down in their retreat. Townsend lay there at the edge of the woods alone, still staring up at the night sky. Aside from the gunfire, he could hear moving away from him. Things were relatively quiet. Then he heard heavy footsteps. Someone was coming up behind him. As the footsteps came to a stop, Townsend watched through his goggles as Jason Voorhees leaned into view, staring down at him. Thanks to the night vision goggles, he could see into the eye holes of the ragged hockey mask, see the rotted meat that surrounded Jason's blank yellow eyes. "Fuck you," Townsend said, only it came out as an incoherent gurgle. Townsend continued to stare into those eyes, even as Jason raised the machete to strike. "That's a fucking firefight out there." Hobbs stomped to the rear hatch of the lav and unlocked it. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what the hell are you doing, man?" Leonard yelped. "Fucking Jason could be out there." Hobb looked back at the other operators. "Not if he's tied to the hood of the other lav." With that, he shoved the hatch open. It clanged into the dirt, and Hobb ran down the metal ramp. Without my gun, he thought. He stared nervously into the darkness around the strike team's camp. The sound of gunfire echoed from across the lake. From Hobbs' position, he couldn't get a look at whatever was happening. He's not going to get me. If they're shooting at him over there, he's not over here. Hobb tried to make himself move and find a spot where he could see Camp Crystal Lake. Fuck it. He might get me. "Hey, Hurley, toss me my gun, will ya?" Hurley picked up Hobbs's FN MK-46, lobbing it to him. It made a satisfying clack as he caught it. The weight of the gun was immediately reassuring. "Wait!" Kelly yelled at him. Hobb turned to look at the woman as she ran halfway down the ramp, pausing to fix with an earnest gaze. "I want to go with you," she said. He looked at Kelly, puzzled. "Why?" Turning his back on her, he took off running through the strike team's base camp. After a moment, Kelly followed. Hurley, Leonard, Atchison, and Ortega exchanged a look. "Fuck it," Ortega said, shrugging. The men slapped their helmets on, grabbed their weapons, and tromped down the ramp. Hobb ran through the soft dirt on the water's edge. Across the lake, he could see muzzle flashes lighting up the night through the trees. The open water carried the crackle of gunfire and the sound of shouting to him. "Holy shit," Hobb muttered. He didn't even hear Kelly running up behind him. "Is it Jason?" Hobb shook his head. "No." He turned, fixing her with a hard look. "No, it isn't." Why didn't you tell us your church buddies happened to bring guns along on their little campouts? She stared at him, overwhelmed. What? Look over there. That's not a church picnic going on, sweetie pie. It's a fucking gun battle. Technically, for it to be called a battle, both sides have to be shooting at each other. Now, why didn't you tell us? Hob shouted at her. I didn't know. Her lip trembled. Great. Now I made the damaged little church girl cry. Hob wished he were somewhere else, behind the counter at a bank maybe. Atchison, Hurley, Leonard, and Ortega came racing up to join Hob and Kelly, all four of them staring wide-eyed at the firefight taking place. Suddenly, a quiet fireball lit up the trees over there, followed a few seconds later by a loud whomp as the sound caught up. Grenade, Hob said. What do we do? Leonard asked. We go help 'em, Hob replied. That's going to be a fucking half-hour drive by the time we get there, Ortega pointed out. It could all be over by then. All the more reason, Hob said. Now let's move our asses. Grabbing Kelly's hand, Hob took off back in the direction of the base camp, leaving the other four men looking at each other. Ortega broke into a run, Atchison, Hurley, and Leonard following his lead. Hob was strapping Kelly into her seat when the other men finally caught up. You stay here with the other lab, Hob told Atchison. He was a little bit surprised when the man nodded and moved to comply. Hurley started for the driver's seat, but Hob stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. I'm driving. But this is my vehicle, Hurley said. You could be wrong in that assumption. Hob shoved past the stupefied operator, practically daring the man to try and stop him. Behind them, Leonard closed the hatch and locked it. Have you ever driven one of these things? Hurley asked. Hob was already settling into the driver's seat. Of course not. Now sit down and shut up. Not waiting for anyone to either sit down or shut up, Hob put his foot to the floor. Kelly's fingers clenched the edge of the bench while she watched Hurley go tumbling past to slam into Leonard's legs. Both men wound up on the floor in a pile. Ortega, clinging to a metal bracket overhead, barked out a laugh. There's not a goddamn funny fucking thing about any of this, Hob snapped. His best friend may very well have been dying. Hob coaxed a little more speed from the lav. The lav's tires thrummed along the two-lane blacktop, laying down the miles at 60 per. The slow part of the trip had been navigating the dirt road leading from the old housing development site. Hob had taken out more than a few trees in the process of learning to steer the enormous armored transport, which only added to the frustration and anger building within him. Once they hit the highway, though, it had been smooth sailing, and thanks to the late hour, there had only been one old flatbed truck to contend with on the road. Hob had very nearly run into the tree lining the highway, and avoiding such a tragedy had created a bit of an ecological disaster by trenching the hell out of the dirt shoulder. But the look on the old farmer's face when he saw the laugh coming at him had been priceless. Overall, however, the big-ass military transport handled only slightly worse than Hob's old Chevy Nova. In the crew compartment, Hurley was whining like a baby at having the driver's seat taken away from him. He cocked a thumb at Hob and whispered to Leonard, All that asshole did was show us down by jumping the wheel. Uprooting all those trees burned a lot of minutes. He shook his head, sneering. Once a fuck-up, always a fuck-up. Overhearing, Kelly tilted her head to look at Hob, wedged into the driver's compartment. She had yet to notice that Ortega, seated across from her, was passing the time by trying to peer up her rumpled sundress. The skirt pushed way up on her pale thighs. Bruno Ortega lolled his head around, looking for the proper angle that would allow him to see the glories that lay buried under the thin fabric. The woman was obviously wiped out, exhausted from everything she'd been through, and the best thing about that sort of fatigue was that she didn't notice how far up her luscious legs the skirt had ridden when she slumped wearily in her seat. No matter what direction he tilted his head, however, he couldn't find the sweet spots. Smoothly, like Lance Burton in Body Armor, Ortega provided the little magician-style sleight of hand by reaching up to scratch a non-existent itch on his stubby chin. As he lowered his hand, he unlatched his seatbelt, covering the click by clearing his throat. With his hand once more at his side, Ortega shifted in his seat, sliding down till his ass hung off the edge of the bench. This provided him with a better angle for the visual exploration of Kelly's inner thighs. He smiled. Better, but not quite what he needed yet. He was sighting down on some seriously tasty flesh under the woman's skirt, but his objective still remained tantalizing, out of view. He scooted his butt down another inch, almost there. If only she'd slumped down a little more. Another shift of his ass brought him closer. He froze in delightful anticipation when Kelly twitched her legs slightly, opening her thighs the tiniest bit further. He thought that maybe she knew what he was up to, and was going to give up the goods. Hell, a good-looking broad like that was only going to waste in church. Maybe she was looking for some action, some real action. Ortega felt a little giddy at the thought, but fought it down. He was going to have to be sly about this, so Leonard and Hurley wouldn't try to horn in on the fun. Ortega rolled his head to the left, then a little further. Bingo. It was uncomfortable holding his head and body in such an awkward position, but there, right before him, hiding back in the shadows, was the panty-clad highway to heaven itself. Looked like Kelly was a white cotton girl to him. Something about that was even naughtier than the tiniest of things. He toyed with the idea of firing up the light slung under the barrel of his rifle so he could get a better look, but that would no doubt bring the show to an angry end. Much smarter to simply ride in pleasant silence and enjoy it while it lasted. Ortega shifted a bit, trying to get comfortable, smiling contently. He let his mind go places that his fingers hungered to follow. Oblivious to the sly voyeurism going on behind him, Hobbs stared out the old highway as the lab gobbled it up. The fierce glare of the headlights revealed every pothole and badly patched crack in the asphalt. As the turnoff for Camp Crystal Lake came into view ahead, Hobbs' edginess and anxiety increased. Slowing the vehicle a little, he figured he'd risk taking out a few more trees in a Dukes of Hazzard-style turn onto the dirt road. That's when the other lav roared out of the darkness directly in their path. Chapter 12. Hobb had time to blurt out, "Shit!" before the lav collided with the second vehicle. The force of the impact lifted Hobbs's lav clear off the pavement, hurling it skyward and skewing towards the left. As the vehicle flipped, Bruno Ortega was thrown from his seat and sent bouncing around the crew compartment. The steel toe of his boot caught Leonard in the face, splitting the man's lower lip open. Kelly screamed, her skirt flinging itself upward to make readily accessible what Ortega had worked so hard to see. The second lav, driven by Samantha Noon, skidded wildly across the highway, the back end swinging around towards the driver. The big armored transport shuddered as rubber was peeled off of the 8 gigantic tires to scar the pavement with thick, black streaks. Almost parallel to the road when it finally hit the shoulder, the lav's tires dug into the soft dirt, lifting the passenger side of the vehicle off the ground and slamming it back down violently. Hobbs's head was brutally slung around as his lav came down on its roof, then went airborne once more. Rolling the transport smashed through the arched Camp Crystal Lake sign that spanned the dirt road and flipped several more times, tearing up trees and underbrush before coming to a creaking halt, resting upside down about 25 yards from the highway. A cloud of dust drifted across the 2-lane road. Metal groaned. Dying engines rattled. And the gentle tone of her girlish voice muffled by the armor plating that surrounded her, Samantha Noon swore loudly, "For the love of fuck's sake!" A clamorous thumping and banging came from within the lab as she kicked viciously at the rear hatch before it finally dropped open. Unleashing the furious Mrs. Noon, she stood on the side of the highway, squinting through the dust and panting heavily. Slowly, as the dust cleared, she made out the shape of the other lav, pitched on its back off in the trees. Inside the transport, Hobb put a hand over his head, or beneath his head, technically, and caught himself as he unfastened his seatbelt and dropped to the roof of the cab. Miraculously, he seemed to be unhurt. In the crew compartment, Leonard was hanging upside down from his seat, struggling to free himself from his seatbelt, and bitching up a storm. Blood poured down from his split lower lip, running up his face and into his nose and eyes, choking him. Hobb grimaced as he saw Ortega splayed out on the ceiling. The man's body was twisted into a shape reminiscent of Evel Knievel during his calamitous Caesar's Palace jump. A small trickle of blood ran from his nose. Hobb bent, felt for a pulse. Nothing. Kelly unlatched her seatbelt and dropped to the floor with a soft grunt. Hobb looked away from her exposed panties, and the woman flipped onto her back and smoothed her skirt. Hurley wasn't moving either. God damn it, Hobb thought. If I killed both these guys because I insisted on driving. He forced the thought away and moved nearer to the man, placing his fingers on his neck. He had a heartbeat, at least. Hurley! Hobb shouted. Hey, Hurley, wake the fuck up! He turned to look at Kelly. Sorry, lady. Are you okay? She looked at him skeptically. You just wrecked the stupid tank and now you're apologizing for saying fuck? Hobb returned his attention to Hurley. What can I say? My mama raised me to have manners. Then be polite and get me the hell down from here, Leonard screeched, his words distorted thanks to his busted lip. I'm fucking drowning in my own blood. Leaving the unconscious man to hang, Hobb went to Leonard's aid. He pulled a knife and held it up. Hold still. Seeing the large blade poised near his midsection, Leonard stopped struggling and prepared himself for the imminent fall. With a deft slice, Hobb cut the seatbelt and Leonard tumbled to the lab's ceiling, landing atop Ortega's broken body. Sorry, buddy, Leonard offered. Sitting up, he stared gravely at the dead man for a moment. You guys are all Emily Post and shit, Kelly said. Show some respect. Lady, the guy's dead, Leonard snapped, whipping thick smears of blood from his face. Stung, Kelly looked away. I'm sorry. Hobb went back to Hurley, reaching under his dangling arms to find the man's seatbelt. Yeah, I guess we're all full of regret around here. What about him? Is he... Leonard started. He's alive. Help me get him down. Leonard stood and moved to help Hobb. Taking a grip on Hurley's shoulders, he waited for Hobb to unlatch the seatbelt. What the hell happened anyway? We hit the other lav. Hold tight now. He released the seatbelt and Hurley's limp body suddenly dropped, twisting in Leonard's grasp. Hobb grabbed his legs and the two men gently placed Hurley on the ceiling, his head practically in Kelly's lap. Get his helmet off, Hobb told her. Somebody banged on the rear hatch. Kelly jumped, jarring Hurley's head. You motherfuckers alive in there? Samantha Noon beat on the metal hatch again. We're okay, Leonard yelled. Mostly, he added, glancing at Ortega. I didn't ask if you were okay, I asked if you were alive. Because when you open this goddamn hatch, I'm going to beat every last one of you to death, Noon said. Hurley's eyes fluttered open, and his head rolled around. Hobb bent to peer into the man's eyes. Are you all right? It took Hurley a second to register. He blinked at Hobb. I'm not even going to say I told you so, he muttered. Noted, Hobb said. Standing, he stepped past Kelly and he went to the hatch. Let's see if we can get this open. Leonard grabbed the bolt, straining to slide it back. It's jammed. Hobb took a grip on the bolt, and the two men wrestled it slowly back, unlocking the hatch. Then, shouldering the heavy steel plating, they began forcing it upwards. As the hatch began to open, Noon's gloved hands appeared at the edge. Two more hands followed, and the hatch moved and rose slowly. Kelly, meanwhile, carefully removed Hurley's helmet and eased the wobbly operator into a sitting position. You sure you're okay? Not really, he said. When they held the hatch at waist level, Noon hunkered down and wedged herself under the steel plate, putting her lug muscles to work and hefting against it like a weightlifter doing squats. Then she saw Hobb. Cock, she hissed, breaking the epitaph into two distinct and quite stinging slurs. Sucker. Suddenly, she let go of the hatch with her right hand and punched Hobb in the face. He staggered back, the blow knocking him away from the hatch. With Hobb no longer holding it in, and Noon only using one hand, the thick steel hatch dropped again. Catching it against his back, Leonard shouted in surprise and pain, Hey, hey, hey! Shaking it off, Hobb quickly rushed back to help raise the hatch. The operators pushed it open to about shoulder level, and he looked down at Kelly. You first, he told her. Kelly hesitated for a second, glancing up at the fierce expression on Samantha Noon's face. Come on, Churchy, Noon demanded. This thing ain't like cotton candy. Swallowing hard, Kelly crawled hurriedly out into the dirt. Hurley followed. Shifting his grip as he moved, Leonard worked his way out next, still helping hold the hatch up. Hobb fixed Noon with the baleful stare. Cautiously, he shifted his grip on the hatch as he moved from beneath it. Just as he was slipping out, Noon released her grip. The hatch dropped a foot before the others caught it again. Hobb hustled out from under the steel plate. He was glad to see Stilton, one of the few operators who seemed to like him, assuming the guy was still in his corner after the lav wreck. Clapping the man on the shoulder, Hobb turned to look at Noon. She was already walking back to the other transport. Through the drifting dust, Hobb could see a handful of operators standing near the vehicle. He couldn't make out any faces. See who he might be missing. "We saw the firefight," he said to Noon's broad back. "What happened?" "Dumb fucking question," Noon said. Hobb started after her, trying to fight the urge to clench his fist. Did you run into Jason Voorhees?" "Dumber fucking question." Hobb came up right behind the woman, shouting at her. "Where is Townsend?" Noon whirled on him. "Take a walk down this road and see for yourself, asshole. And you might find parts of a few other people along the way." Hobb stared at her. He knew where things were headed as the words tumbled from his lips. He's dead?" "Dumbest fucking question," Noon snarled, turning her back on Hobb and walking away once again. "How many?" Hobb asked, looking beyond Noon, trying to count the operators on the other side of the road. "How many are dead?" Noon ignored him and kept walking. "I asked you a goddamn question," he shouted. "Is Seaver dead?" Still no answer. Not that Hobb needed to hear it. Chris Seaver hated his guts, possibly even more than Noon did. And if anybody was going to get in his face after the lav wreck, it would be Seaver, unless he had bought it. Hobb ran up behind Noon, reaching for her. "Answer me, goddammit!" As his hand came down on Noon's shoulder, the woman spun and drove a hard fist into Hobb's already damaged right eye. The flash of pain as a split over his eyebrow opened up once again nearly dropped him to the dirt. He staggered slightly, forcing himself to catch his balance. "Hey!" Leonard yelled, leaving the wrecked lav, and hobbled towards Noon and Hobb. "Stay out of this," Noon warned him. Hobb put his hand to his eye. It came away bloody. He stared at the gore running down his gloved fingers. His skull was ringing like someone had laid into him with a sledgehammer. "That's just about enough," he said to no one in particular. "Oh, far from it, motherfucker," Noon hissed. She darted in and slugged Hobb again, sending him stumbling backwards. "This is fucking bullshit," Leonard yelled, approaching the woman. Samantha Noon stood with her fists clenched and held high to guard her face, her upper body swaying as she waited for Hobb to fight or flee. She shot an ice-cold glance at Leonard. "You stepping up to the plate now, bitch?" Leonard paused, considering. This was one scary goddamn chick. He looked at the blood streaming down Hobbs' face from the gash in his forehead. "Stay out of it," Hobb told him. "I got your back," Leonard said. That surprised the hell out of Hobb, to say the least. "I said stay out of it," he told Leonard. Reluctantly, Leonard stepped back a little to let Noon know he wanted none of her fury coming his way, but wasn't quite ready to give up on the role of peacemaker. "Look, Noon, if Seaver's dead," he began. "Then the fuck-up is in charge," Noon finished for him. She sneered at Hobb. "But not if he can't fucking walk or talk." Hobb wiped blood from his eye. The operators from Noon's lab were making their way across the highway, coming to check out the show. One was limping badly. Was that Lovinger? While another was clinging to the shoulder of someone else. How many of them wanted to fight him? Would rather beat the shit out of him than see him take command of the strike team. Hell, the last thing on earth Hobb wanted was to lead a bunch of people who hated him on a mission that had already gotten fucked like a $5 crack whore. He stared at Noon. Her body was practically vibrating with the raging desire to stomp a mud hole in his ass. Even disregarding the pain he was already experiencing, he didn't have much enthusiasm for fighting the woman. For starters, he didn't like the idea of hitting a girl. Although referring to Noon as such was more than a little ridiculous. She could probably hold her own with the Mike Tyson, as long as he didn't start biting, and maybe even then. But even more than the gentlemanly manners his mom and dad had taught him, he was concerned about getting the stuffing kicked out of him in front of the entire strike team. Not much choice, though. If he were to throw down with Noon and lose, things would be bad enough, but if he were to walk away, let her back him down, whatever minuscule respect the other team members might have had for him would be gone forever. Hobb risked a quick glance at Kelly, who was standing near the wrecked lab with Hurley. She looked like she was auditioning for Talia Schreier's role in the remake of Rocky. Her face, a picture-perfect mask of waifish concern. So taken was he with Kelly's apparent worry, Hobb almost caught Noonan's fist in his face a third time. Seeing her movement an instant before the blow could strike, he ducked to the side, and she tagged the edge of his helmet instead, still managing to give his neck a painful snap. Hobb came up in a fighting stance, angling his body towards Noon to provide a narrower target, and keeping his fist up in front of his face. The big broad might be an ass-kicking bruiser, but she still had that pretty, girlish bone structure in her face. Hobb thought that if he could connect with her sculpted cheekbones a couple times, it might make her think twice about things. Barking out a huff of air, Hobb snapped a quick left at Noon. She twisted, blocking with her right forearm. Hobb followed up with the right, catching the woman in the side, her bulletproof vest absorbing most of the impact. The other members of the strike team had gathered around in a loose circle. Hobb was happy to see that no one had the sack to cheer Noon on, at least. She swung at him again, her fist coming straight at his goddamn right eye again. Hobb snapped his head back, and the blow barely tapped the end of his nose, just enough to light up a flashbulb in his brain and make his eyes water. Unfortunately, it also caused him to sneeze, just once, but Noon took advantage of it and drove a hard right, dead on into the cut over his right eye. Droplets of blood trailed from her knuckles as she withdrew the fist. Hobb staggered back, wincing in agony. A thick wave of blood poured down from the wound, completely blinding him in that eye. Noon moved in fast, nailing him with a stiff blow in the gut. His vest took the best part of the contact, but the punch still drove a lot of the wind from his lungs. Instantly, another fist buried itself in his left cheek, tossing his head back at a funny angle, and sending spit and blood gushing from his mouth. Faces whirled past as Hobb spun around. He came down on his knees, facing towards Kelly. Girls weren't supposed to hit this hard, were they? What the hell would Townsend think of him if he saw this shit? Or Lauren, for that matter. Should have worked in a bank, Hobb thought. Lauren, she'd be home in bed by now, or sprawled out on the couch watching an old movie. He wished he had had some way to contact her, let her know how much he loved her, and how sorry he was to have taken Jeff up on the offer to join the strike team. Then, Noon's boot caught him in the side, directly under his left arm. Something in there made an extremely unpleasant crunching sound. As Hobb fell, he managed to hook Noon's ankle in the crook of his arm, yanking her off balance. "Motherfucker!" she shouted, giving Hobb a little twinge of delight that somehow managed to squirm upwards through all of the pain. Both combatants dropped to the dirt, Noon landing behind Hobb. He quickly rode towards the woman, driving a fist into her lusciously kissable lips. She yelped in pain, and Hobb saw blood on her teeth. Finally, shoving himself to his feet, he started to swing a heavy boot at her, but was kept in check by his conscience. "All right, you punched her in the face, but kicking a woman in the ribs, shame on you." "Fuck off, buddy," Hobb told the tiny voice, following through with the kick after all. "It's not your ass she's beating." Thanks to Hobb's instant of hesitation, Noon saw the kick coming and was able to roll with the blow. Using her momentum, she snapped up to her feet again, facing off with her new commanding officer. She wiped a knuckle across her swollen, split lower lip, glanced at the blood, then fixed Hobb with a furious gaze. "You better enjoy it," she snarled, "because that's all you're gonna get." "That's what I'm afraid of," Hobb thought. He flexed his fingers, readying himself. His knuckles cracked loudly. One of his fingers didn't seem to be working properly at the moment. Noon came at him and threw a left, the punch coming up short. Hobb went in with the right. The woman ducked her head, and his fist connected painfully with the top of her Kevlar helmet. As Hobb drew back, howling in pain, Noon closed the gap between the two and put a brutal right directly into his mouth. She was already back in her fighting stance and swaggering cockily before Hobb hit the ground. "Yeah, don't feel so good, does it?" she said, snickering. I could just lie here quietly, Hobb thought, tasting blood as it ran across his tongue. Maybe they'd all get bored after a while, go away and just leave me alone. Willing himself to move, he raised up to a sitting position. Blood seeped down his chin. Gingerly, he felt his aching mouth. His upper lip was split wide open, cut by his front teeth, one of which was frightfully loose. As his finger touched the tooth, it dropped from his mouth, landing on his bulletproof vest. He stared at it for a second. "Ah, bitch," Hobb slurred, growling at Noon. "That was my favorite tooth." As he pushed himself to his feet, Noon rushed him, slamming a shoulder into his gut and taking him to the ground once again. They hit the dirt, a tangle of wildly flailing limbs, each trying to connect with any kind of blow. No longer able to control their schoolyard brawl tribal instincts, the other team members immediately crowded around Noon and Hob, shouting and egging them on. Hob was definitely getting the worst of it. Noon had him down on his back and was slamming her little rock-hard girl knuckles repeatedly into his fucked-up right eye, and he was rapidly becoming sick of it. He swung upwards with a left that caught her in the nose, but the punch barely slowed her down. She nailed him in the bad eye with 2 more blows. "You fucking idiots!" Hob heard Kelly scream from the sidelines. He caught a glimpse of her running around, trying to force her way through the onlookers. Another fist pounded Hobbs's face. He tried to get an arm up to block, but Noon was out of control, a raging maniac bent on hammering his face into a bloody pulp. No doubt about it, he was going to go home in a wet sack. Gotta do something drastic, Hob told himself. It didn't take much to figure out what that was going to have to be. While allowing a couple more punches to connect with his battered kisser, Hob stealthily slipped his left hand inside Noon's bulletproof vest. Gritting his teeth, he cupped the woman's ample right tit in his hand and squeezed as hard as he could, his fingers sinking into the tender but firm flesh. Noon shrieked in pain, cursing and writhing. Instead of giving up, however, she only trained her fist down on Hobbs's head even harder than before, and so he squeezed even harder. Noon screamed. The punches slowed. Hob clenched her breast for all he was worth, his hand quivering violently with the effort. With a high-pitched squeal of distress, Noon flung herself away from Hob, wrenching her anguished breast from his cruel grasp. Just lifting his tenderized head off the ground took intense effort, but Hob knew it was now or never. Forcing himself to his feet, he staggered over to where Noon sat gingerly cupping her sore boob. Grabbing the edges of her helmet on either side of her head, he slammed his knee into her face. Then he did it a second time, just because it seemed like the thing to do. There was also the added bonus that it just plain felt good. Maintaining his grip on her helmet, he stared down at her. She wasn't struggling anymore. Hell, she wasn't even holding her tit anymore. "See what you get for fucking with me," he mumbled. Hob looked up from the woman, his one good eye moving across the faces of the strike team members surrounding him. They stared back expectantly, many of them sporting dumbfounded, open-mouthed expressions. Fucking caveman, he thought. Panting, Hob pitched Noon's limp form to the ground. Looking at the men around him once again, he peeled his lips back in a blood-stained sneer. "Okay, who's next?" Their answer took the form of a nervous step back, giving Hob a little breathing room. Kelly pushed through the crowd, going to Hobbs' side. She examined his body and his bloody face, the right eye buried in puffy folds of flesh, the eyelid glued shut with gore. Hobbs' tongue darted out to lick his lips. Wavering only a little, he addressed the troops. Now rip your waggedy asses into shape, because we're going back to Crystal Lake." Meredith lay curled on her side in her bunk bed. She wasn't alone in the cabin this time. When they were getting everybody ready for the fight with the soldiers, Mr. Rickles had herded all the women and children off to the family cabins to wait. This time, though, Meredith wished she were alone. She felt weird, like something inside her had curled up and died, and now lay heavily in her stomach. When they first arrived at Camp Crystal Lake, back before she knew how rotten Father Long and his brainless, bleeding sheep really were, she had chosen the bottom bunk because it was cave-like and cozy. Sometimes in the afternoon, when she had finished all her chores, she used to come back here and hang a blanket from the upper bunk, then crawl into her bed and hide in the dark. That was when she'd pretend Kelly was with her, touching her in ways that made her feel almost crazy. Her mom had nearly caught her one time, with her pants pulled down and her fingers moving between her legs, and Meredith thought her heart would stop from fear and excitement and guilt. What she had been doing was a mortal sin, after all, especially when another girl was the object of her terrible, lustful thoughts. A tear rolled down from Meredith's eye, soaking into the pillow that was bunched up beneath her head. She'd never had to worry about her mom catching her being bad ever again, and Kelly was gone too. Probably. Maybe not. No. Meredith didn't want to believe it, but she didn't think it was very smart to pretend otherwise. She'd just have to get used to the idea that Kelly was dead, and very soon now her name was going to be Meredith Rickles, assuming she lived long enough for the ex-Marine to collect his little reward. She sniffled softly, trying to fight the tears. Some of the other people in the cabin had been crying when they were listening to all the guns and the shouting, but not Meredith. She swore she wouldn't cry for any of these people, especially not the ones who were shooting at the soldiers. So she waited. Then, when the gunshots had stopped and nobody was screaming anymore, she cried for her mom and dad. And now she cried for Kelly. And for herself, for that part of her that had died during Father Long's insane sermon in the main cabin, when she had let Mr. Rickles hold her close. Rickles. She hadn't seen him since before the gunfight. He had brought her here and tucked her into bed and kissed her, first on the forehead but then on the mouth. She had kept her lips pressed tightly together, but Rickles had pushed his fat, wormy tongue between them, smearing it around on the front of her teeth. She knew he wanted to put his tongue deeper into her mouth, but she clenched her jaws together and wouldn't let him, so he just kept rubbing it around against her teeth and sucking at her lips. He tasted the way old bacon grease smelled, and when he had left, she prayed he'd be killed. Just another sin the Lord could check off next to her name in his big book of judgment. Maybe Rickles had been killed. Nobody had come to the cabin since the gunfight ended, but she knew the soldiers hadn't won. If they had, they would have rescued her. Besides, she'd heard voices outside, excited, running around, and she had recognized some of them. Don James and a couple others, for sure. But she didn't think she'd heard Rickles, so maybe he was dead, if she was lucky. If God cared about her even one tiny fucking bit... No, don't think like that. Of course God cared about her. But he certainly didn't owe her anything, did he? God helps those who help themselves. Maybe that was the problem. She was waiting for someone to save her. Meredith sat up in her cave-like bunk, legs folded beneath her, and stared towards the cabin door. She stared towards the cabin door. Could she get away? And where would she go if she could? It was dark out there. She could run fast, and Mr. Rickles had that bad foot, but he was stronger and sneakier, and she didn't know how far he was willing to go to keep her from getting away from him. It struck her then. I'm more scared of Mr. Rickles than I am of Jason Voorhees, she thought. Jason would only kill her. Run, girl, just do it! She glanced around the room at the other women, waiting for some kind of word of the battle. They looked like mannequins, blank, staring, stupid. Meredith scooted to the edge of her bunk and bent down to retrieve her shoes where Mr. Rickles had pushed them under her bed. Slipping them on, she got up and started for the door. Where are you going? Meredith froze, gasping softly. She looked to her left to where Susan Perkins sat in an old rocking chair, tugging obsessively at her right thumb. The woman held Meredith's gaze for a moment, then closed her eyes. I have to go to the bathroom, Meredith whispered. Susan Perkins didn't seem to have heard or to care either way if she had. Meredith took another step towards the door just as it swung open. She felt her belly lurch violently. Curtis Rickles stood in the doorway. He smiled pleasantly at her. Coming to greet your loving man at the door? She tried to smile, but couldn't be sure it came out that way. Rickles stepped inside, taking Meredith's hands in his own. His skin was rough and dry. We won, honey, he said, gazing into her eyes. We won. She finally had an answer to her questions. She couldn't get away, no matter how hard she tried. Kelly had seen fellas thrown down during the course of her distinguished bar-hopping career, but she could honestly say she'd never seen a fight like the one she'd witnessed tonight in her entire life, and with a woman involved, no less. And that woman was one hell of a tough bitch. Kelly grimaced as she mopped blood from the commando guy's shredded face. His name was Ham, wasn't it? Like the beer? Still, she didn't want to call him Ham and find out she was wrong. Then she'd feel like an even bigger idiot. Safer if she just didn't call him anything. The other one, the fucking Xena reject broad, she'd done a tremendous number on commando guy's face. A real tap dance. She was in pretty rough shape herself, and Kelly could tell her boob was killing her. The way she sat around trying to act like she wasn't cradling the tender tit in her arms. But she didn't suffer anything near the damage that the guy had, except maybe to her ego. The woman didn't seem nearly as smug as she had earlier. The strike team was gathered around the tank that was still upright. Some sat around nursing the wounds they'd suffered, while others kept a watch on the force to make sure nobody, Jason or Jesus Freak, managed to sneak up on them. Jesus Freak. Kelly knew that's what the commandos thought she was, and she hated it. "Ow!" Hobbs said calmly as Kelly took a particularly energetic swipe at his injured face with the towel she held. "Sorry." Kelly had never been good at playing nursemaid. She leaned back, taking a long look at his swollen, bleeding face. He barely looked human. He stared back at her. "Is it really that bad?" Kelly considered for a moment. "Yeah," she finally said. As she moved to dab away another trickle of blood, the medic, Mosley, stepped up, kneeling alongside her. "I can take over now," he said reassuringly. Kelly smiled at the commando guy. "Thanks," he told her. She thought he was smiling back, but it might have just been a grimace of pain. Standing, she stepped aside to get out of Mosley's way as the medic went to work. Looking around at the soldiers, Kelly still couldn't quite believe all this was happening, or that she had allowed herself to get involved in it. She felt pathetic. "Hey, there's a girl I'm worried about," she blurted into the commando guy. She wished like hell that she could remember his name. He looked up at her with his one good eye. "There are several people I'm worried about. How can you pick just one?" "Because she doesn't belong there. In the church, I mean. And one of Father Long's, I don't know, sidekicks, I guess, has a thing for her." "Why? Is that a problem?" Hobbs said. "She's 17. The tough chick Noon spoke up. "That's some fucked up shit, dude." "I don't know what kind of church you people are running," Commando Guy began. Kelly cut him off. "It's not my church. I told you that before." She looked away from him, feeling foolish. I just kind of fell into it. It was dumb. I was dumb." "I'll say," he yelped again as the medic applied something to his face. "That shit stings, Mosley." "The good stuff always does," Mosley said. "Now hold still." Commando Guy returned his attention to Kelly. He was actually looking a little better now that he had a real medic working him over. "And just how did you fall in with this particular church, honey?" Kelly exhaled sharply. "Sin. How else?" She felt the eyes of the entire strike team on her. A whole lot of sin. Okay. This has been Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath, chapters 11 and 12. I hope everybody enjoyed. I was a little late getting this video out today. I apologize for that. Just remember, be sure to like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell so you know when I put new chapters out. We're getting close to finishing this book, and I'm going to leave y'all at the end of this video with a little hint of what our next novel will be once Church of the Divine Psychopath is finished. Everybody have a great day. Remember, if I get to 100 subscribers before we finish this book, I will give this book to one of you lucky subscribers based on the comments section. So spread the word. Let's get some more subs, and let's get these books out to everybody. With all that said, here's the hint at the next novel I'll be narrating as soon as we finish this one. It's a little on the nose, but I hope it gets you excited for it. I'm excited for it.
Never sleep again.